Echo is the first sounding of being in withdrawal. Abandonment is the historical mode of being's concealment. The distress of being compels thinking toward another beginning. Thinking unfolds not as a sequence, but as a jointure. Each joining stands for itself while resonating with all others in sudden, hidden unity. This unity is not constructed but grounded in the site of decision where a transition of history is at stake. Each joining speaks the same event, being as a nouning from a different essential domain. The structure of thinking is therefore not linear, but fugue-like, recurrence without repetition. Echo is the first experience of being's essential swaying as it arises in withdrawal, before full articulation. Echo is characterized by silence, expectation, and intimation. It is the sound of what has not yet fully emerged. What echoes is not a being, but an occurrence. The event of being withdrawing while intimating itself. Echo places thinking within a decision, whether being will remain withdrawn or re-emerge. The abandonment of being is the condition in which beings appear deprived of the relation to being. This abandonment is not merely privation, but a mode of being's occurrence as withdrawal. Forgottenness of being is the consolidation of abandonment. Where the absence of being is no longer recognized as absence. In forgottenness, beings are taken as self-sufficient, and the question of being disappears entirely. The epoch of forgottenness is the epoch of total unquestioning. The epoch of forgottenness is the epoch of total unquestioning. The distress of being emerges when its withdrawal becomes extreme and its absence becomes decisive. This distress is not psychological but ontological. It is the pressure of being calling for its own disclosure. Distress compels thinking, not by force, but by awakening the necessity of response. The greatest danger is not distress, but the absence of distress, the distress of distresslessness. Mechanization is the mode in which being occurs as total markability. Mechanization is the mode in which being occurs as total makeability, rendering all beings as producible and calculable. Mechanization is not a human activity, but an epochal mode of being itself. In mechanization, beings are understood through cause, production, and control. There's nothing "what up" in the chat. There hasn't been a single question asked about anything I read for the last 600 videos I've made. The culmination of mechanization is the disappearance of any boundary to production. Lived experience is the subjective masking of mechanizations, where beings gain meaning only through their relation to the subject. In lived experience, beings lose their own being and become functions of subjective life. The more intense the experience, the more concealed the abandonment of being. Pleasure and stimulation replace truth as the criteria of reality. The gigantic is the completion of the mechanization where all beings become quantitatively calculable without limit. The gigantic is the completion of the mechanizations where all beings become quantitatively calculable without limit. In this gigantic, quantity replaces quality and measure replaces meaning. What's up in the chat is just bots saying hello. Representation becomes total. Everything is pre-grasped, planned, and arranged in advance. The limitless expansion of calculation dissolves all boundaries of being. Modern science is grounded in mechanizations presupposing the calculable and the measurability of all beings. Experiment does not discover but confirms what calculation has already projected. Science becomes dominant when it claims to be the sole form of knowledge. In this dominance, science no longer questions its own ground. Echo initiates the transition between the first and the other beginning, placing thinking within a historical decision. The task of thinking is not to produce a new system, but to prepare the time-space for another beginning of being. Preparation consists in letting the abandonment of being become manifest. Through this manifestation, the echo of being may resound more fully. Another beginning is not constructed but granted through announcing. The age of systems has passed. Truth occurs as unconcealing concealment. Being withdraws in order to disclose. Being is not an object among beings, but the event through which beings are granted or withdrawn. Thus all ontology must be regrounded as eventual rather than representational. The event is not a happening within time, but the originary appropriation that gives time, space, and relation their possibility. Thinking does not produce the event, but is appropriated by it. Therefore, thinking is response rather than construction. The event unfolds as a turning, where call and response, concealment and unconcealment, mutually constitute one another. The fundamental plight of the epoch is the abandonment of beings by being, whereby beings no longer shelter truth but appear as empty availabilities. This abandonment manifests as calculability, acceleration, and total organization, which conceal the withdrawal of being beneath apparent fullness. Mechanization is the historical mode through which beings become reducible to production, control, and representation. Lived experience reinforces the abandonment of centering all relation within subjectivity, thereby closing access to the event. The truth of being unfolds through 6 junctures: resonating, interplay, leap, grounding, the future ones, the last God, which are not linear stages but interpreting domains. The truth of being unfolds through 6 junctures: resonating, interplay, leap, grounding, the future ones, and the last God, which are not linear stages but interpenetrating domains. Each juncture speaks the same truth differently. Therefore, multiplicity of articulation does not imply fragmentation but depth. Resonating occurs as the felt absence of being. Interplay mediates between beginnings. Leap opens Dasein's grounding, shelters truth. The future one sustain it, the last God intimates decision. The leap is the transition from representational thinking to eventual thinking, wherein thought enters the openness of being. Dasein is not the human subject, but the site where being discloses itself as truth. To be Dasein is to stand within the clearing of unconcealing concealment and to sustain its openness. Grounding Dasein is not constructing a foundation, but holding open the abyss where truth may occur. The ground of being is abyssal. It grounds precisely by withholding ground. The abyss is experienced as emptiness, lack, or withdrawal. Yet this very emptiness is the opening of truth. Thinking must withstand the abyss, not resolve it. Endurance is the mode of access to truth. The clearing arises from this abyss as the spacing in which beings may appear. Thinking is guided not by concepts but by fundamental attunements that arise from being itself. Shock dislodges thought from the familiar and reveals beings as abandoned. Restraint sustains openness to withdrawal without collapsing its nihilism. Restraint sustains openness to withdrawal without collapsing into nihilism. Diffidence is the hesitant nearness to what withdraws, preserving the tension of truth. Silence is the originary language in which the event is first born. Truth is not correctness, but the dynamic unity of unconcealing and concealing. Concealment is not originary than unconcealment. Concealment is more originary than unconcealment. Disclosure always carries withdrawal within it. Truth is not correctness, but the dynamic unity of unconcealing and concealing. Concealment is more originary than unconcealment. Disclosure always carries withdrawal within it. Truth occurs only in a clearing, which is self, opened by the refusal of being. Decision is not a choice between alternatives, but the opening of a space where differentiation itself becomes possible. The event is the site of decision where humans and gods, world and earth encounter one another. Thinking stands within undecidability, sustaining the tension from which decision emerges. The decision of another beginning depends on whether humans remain subjects or become grounders of Dasein. The other beginning is not a chronological future, but the transformation in the way of being discloses itself. It arises from the interplay between the first beginning and the withdrawal that defines the present epoch. The other beginning requires the grounding of truth in beings through words, works, and deeds. The future ones are those who ground design by sheltering truth within beings. They are not defined by identity, but by their attunement to the events. The last God is not an entity, but the extreme possibility of decision, marked by absence, withdrawal, and passing. The nearness of the divine occurs precisely as its remoteness. Arrival and flight are one movement. Being and beings are not separable domains, but are differentiated within the event. Being and beings are not separable domains, but are differentiated within the event. Being grounds a disclosure, beings shelter a manifestation. The relation to beings must preserve their role as sites of truth, rather than reduce them to objects of control. Time and space arise as a unified playing field opened by the event. Temporalization is the ecstatic stretching between what has been and what is to come. Spatialization is the holding open of this stretch as a site of presence. The moment is the convergence of these dimensions as a site of decision. Thinking must become poetic, not explanatory, but letting appear. Language does not describe the event, but shelters it. Words arise from silence and return to silence. Their failure is the first path. The structure of thinking must grow like a living form, not be imposed as a system. The structure of thinking must grow like a living form, not be imposed as a system. Systematic philosophy belongs to metaphysics and presupposes truth as certainty. Evental thinking rejects system in favor of unfolding articulation. Order arises immanently from the event, not from conceptual imposition. Thinking is historical insofar as it responds to the singularity of its epoch. The present epoch is defined by withdrawal, abandonment, and machine domination. The task of thinking is to prepare the ground for another beginning by opening the clearing of truth. The task of thinking is to prepare the ground for another beginning by opening the clearing of truth.